The ancient dynasties of Europe, the order established by kings over centuries, the borders empires believed unshakable. All of them collapsed one by one before an officer born as the child of an ordinary family in Corsica. While still a young general, he changed France's destiny, then single-handedly redrew Europe's political map. Rising through victories, falling through mistakes, and irreversibly altering the course of history. This man's name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Now we take you into the real story of this leader, praised as a genius, yet forever surrounded by controversy. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, the capital city of Corsica, just over a year after the island had been sold to France by the Republic of Genoa. This timing would prove symbolically significant throughout his life, as he remained caught between his Corsican roots and French identity. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and minor Corsican nobleman who had initially supported Pasquale Pauli's resistance against French rule, but later reconciled with the French authorities to secure advantages for his family. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, came from a family with similar modest, noble standing and would become known for her strong character and stern discipline, traits she would pass on to her children. The Bonaparte family was large. Napoleon was the second surviving child among 8 siblings who reached adulthood. The family lived in relative modesty despite their noble status, constantly managing finances carefully to maintain their social position and provide education for their children. Carlo Bonaparte's decision to collaborate with French authorities opened doors that would have otherwise remained closed to the family. Through connections with the French governor of Corsica, he secured scholarships for his sons to attend prestigious schools in mainland France. This calculated political maneuvering, though criticized by some Corsican patriots, created the pathway for Napoleon's eventual rise. In 1779, at the age of 9, Napoleon left Corsica for the first time, traveling to France with his older brother Joseph. While Joseph was sent to the College of Autun, Napoleon was destined for a military education. After a brief period learning French at Autun, where his thick Corsican accent and imperfect command of the language made him a target for mockery by other students, Napoleon was transferred to the Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château in May 1779. Brienne was a preparatory school for the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, accepting boys from poor noble families and providing them with a military education. Napoleon spent 5 years at Brienne from ages 9 to 15, a formative period that shaped his character profoundly. He was smaller than most other boys, spoke French with a heavy accent, and came from what many mainland French considered a barely civilized island. These factors made him an outsider, subject to bullying and social isolation. Rather than breaking him, this isolation forged his determination and self-reliance. He threw himself into his studies, particularly excelling in mathematics and military theory. He devoured books on history, especially studying the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. During his time at Brienne, he developed the intense work ethic and strategic thinking that would later define his military career. He also maintained a deep connection to his Corsican identity, often defending the island's honor against French students who mocked it, sometimes through physical fights despite his small stature. Napoleon's academic performance, especially in mathematics and military subjects, earned him recognition from his instructors. In October 1784, at age 15, he was selected as one of only 4 students from Brienne to attend the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, the premier military academy in France. This was an extraordinary achievement, particularly for someone from his background. The École Militaire was where the French military elite were trained, and admission was highly competitive. In Paris, Napoleon received advanced training in artillery, a technical branch that required strong mathematical skills and offered opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than aristocratic connections. The artillery was becoming increasingly important in European warfare, and Napoleon's choice of this specialization would prove decisive in his future military success. At the École Militaire, Napoleon continued to face social challenges. Most of his fellow students came from wealthy aristocratic families and could afford fashionable clothes, leisure activities, and social events that were beyond his means. Napoleon maintained his austere habits, avoiding social gatherings and focusing intensely on his studies. He completed the 2-year program in just 1 year, an exceptional accomplishment that demonstrated both his intellectual capacity and his drive. In September 1785, at age 16, he graduated and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery regiment of La Fère, stationed in Valence. This achievement marked his entry into the professional French military, but it came at a poignant moment. His father Carlo had died just 2 months earlier, in February 1785, leaving the family in financial difficulties. As one of the eldest sons, Napoleon felt responsible for supporting his mother and siblings, a burden that would weigh on him throughout his early career. Napoleon's early years as a junior officer coincided with the final years of the Ancien Regime in France. From 1785 to 1789, he served in various artillery postings, spending much of his time on leave in Corsica due to the relatively relaxed military discipline of the period. These years were marked by intense self-education and political awakening. He read voraciously across multiple subjects: philosophy, history, geography, and political theory. He was particularly influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, reading works by Rousseau, Voltaire, and other philosophers who questioned absolute monarchy and championed reason and merit. During his extended stays in Corsica, he became involved in local politics, initially aligning himself with Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican nationalist leader who had returned from exile. Napoleon harbored ambitions for Corsica's independence or at least greater autonomy within France, seeing himself potentially as a leader in this movement. The French Revolution began in 1789 when Napoleon was just shy of his 20th birthday. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, sent shockwaves through French society and military. For Napoleon, the revolution represented both chaos and opportunity. The old system, based on aristocratic privilege, was being swept away, replaced by principles of merit, talent, and republican virtue. This aligned perfectly with his own experiences and resentments. He had always felt held back by his modest background and outsider status. Now, the revolution promised careers open to talent regardless of birth. At the same time, the revolution created instability, with many aristocratic officers emigrating or being purged, opening up rapid advancement opportunities for those who remained loyal to the revolutionary government. From 1789 to 1793, Napoleon navigated the increasingly radical phases of the revolution while spending significant time in Corsica. He witnessed the transition from constitutional monarchy to republic, the rise of radical factions, and the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars as France found itself at war with much of Europe. In Corsica, his relationship with Paoli deteriorated as Paoli became increasingly suspicious of radical republicanism and of Napoleon's family's association with the French revolutionary authorities. By 1793, the Bonaparte family had fallen out completely with Paoli, who now controlled Corsica and was moving toward an alliance with Britain. The family was forced to flee Corsica permanently, arriving as refugees in mainland France in June 1793. This forced departure from his homeland was emotionally devastating for Napoleon, but it also removed his last ties to Corsica and fully committed him to a career in France. The year 1793 proved to be the crucial turning point in Napoleon's career. France was in crisis, surrounded by enemies abroad and torn by a civil war at home. The radical Jacobin government, dominated by Maximilien Robespierre, had initiated the Reign of Terror to eliminate internal enemies. The Revolutionary Wars were going badly at several fronts, and major French cities were in rebellion against the revolutionary government. One such city was Toulon, France's most important Mediterranean naval base, which had been taken over by royalist rebels who invited British and Spanish forces to occupy it in August 1793. Recapturing Toulon was absolutely essential for the revolutionary government, both strategically and symbolically. Napoleon, now a captain, happened to be in the region when the siege of Toulon began in September 1793. The commander of artillery at the siege was wounded, and Napoleon was appointed to replace him through the recommendation of a fellow Corsican officer and political connections with Representative Augustin Robespierre, brother of Maximilian. This appointment, though seemingly minor, gave Napoleon his first real opportunity to demonstrate his military genius. He arrived at the siege to find a disorganized operation with no clear strategic plan. The commanding generals were political appointees with limited military skill. Napoleon immediately assessed the situation with brilliant clarity. While others focused on directly assaulting the city walls, he recognized that the key to taking Toulon lay in capturing a fort called l'Aiguillette, which controlled the narrow harbor entrance. If French artillery could be positioned there, they could make the harbor untenable for the British and Spanish fleets, forcing them to evacuate and leaving the rebels defenseless. Napoleon threw himself into the siege with characteristic energy. He organized the artillery, positioned batteries with mathematical precision, and constantly exposed himself to enemy fire to supervise operations, being wounded in the thigh during one engagement. He personally directed artillery bombardments, working alongside his men with little sleep or rest. His plan was initially resisted by the commanding generals, but he eventually convinced them, partly through the support of the political representatives with the army, particularly the younger Robespierre. On December 17, 1793, French forces stormed Fort l'Aiguillette following a concentrated artillery barrage. Napoleon personally led one of the assault columns. The fort fell, and exactly as Napoleon had predicted, the Allied fleet evacuated almost immediately. Without naval support, the Royalist position in Toulon became hopeless, and the city surrendered on December 19th. The recapture of Toulon was a major victory for the revolutionary government, and Napoleon's role was undeniable. At just 24 years old, he was promoted to brigadier general on December 22, 1793, skipping several ranks. This was an extraordinary advancement, particularly in the meritocratic environment of the Revolution, where military talent was desperately needed and could be rapidly rewarded. Napoleon had demonstrated not just technical competence in artillery, but strategic vision and decisive leadership. His name reached Paris, and he was noted by important political figures. However, the aftermath of Toulon also introduced him to the darker side of revolutionary politics. The recapture was followed by brutal reprisals against the city's inhabitants, with thousands executed as traitors. Napoleon witnessed these massacres, but, focused on his military career, did not openly oppose them. Napoleon's rapid rise continued in early 1794, when he was given command of artillery for the Army of Italy, operating along the Mediterranean coast against Piedmont, Sardinia, and Austria. However, the volatile politics of revolutionary France soon threatened his career. In July 1794, the Thermidorian reaction overthrew Robespierre and the radical Jacobins. Napoleon had been associated with the Robespierres, and this connection now became dangerous. He was briefly arrested in August 1794 on suspicion of being a Jacobin conspirator, imprisoned for about 2 weeks before being released without charges due to lack of evidence. This brush with the guillotine reminded Napoleon of how quickly fortunes could turn in revolutionary France. After his release, he found himself temporarily sidelined, with assignments that seemed beneath his talents and capabilities. By 1795, Napoleon's career seemed stalled. He was in Paris, underemployed, relatively poor, and frustrated. He even briefly considered taking a military advisory position with the Ottoman Empire to escape his circumstances. Then on October 5, 1795, another turning point arrived. Royalist rebels in Paris, emboldened by recent elections that favored conservatives and opposed to the new constitution, staged an insurrection with thousands of armed protesters marching on the convention. The government forces were poorly organized and outnumbered. Paul Barras, a powerful member of the Directory, the new executive government, remembered Napoleon's success at Toulon and urgently summoned him to organize the defense of the convention. Napoleon was appointed second in command under Barras, but effectively given operational control. Napoleon acted with swift decisiveness. He sent a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to seize artillery pieces from a nearby arms depot before the rebels could get them. He positioned these cannon at strategic points around the convention and in the narrow streets where rebel columns would advance. When the Royalist forces attacked on October 5th, Napoleon ordered his artillery to fire grapeshot directly into the crowds at point-blank range. The effect was devastating. The rebel columns were shattered by the artillery fire, suffering heavy casualties and breaking in panic. The insurrection was crushed within hours with relatively minimal casualties on the government side, but considerable losses among the rebels. Napoleon's ruthless efficiency in defending the government through what became known as a whiff of grapeshot made him the savior of the Republic. This success transformed Napoleon's position. Within days, he was promoted to Major General and given command of the Army of the Interior, responsible for internal security in France. More importantly, he gained the patronage of Barras and other Directory members who now saw him as a valuable political military asset. His new prominence also brought him into Parisian society. At a social gathering, he met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior with 2 children from her previous marriage to an aristocrat who had been executed during the Terror. Josephine was well-connected in society, sophisticated, and experienced in ways that the young, socially awkward Napoleon was not. He fell intensely in love with her, pursuing her with passionate letters despite her initial coolness and despite warnings from his family that she was unsuitable. They married in a civil ceremony on March 9th, 1796, just 2 days before Napoleon departed to take up his next assignment, command of the Army of Italy. The appointment to command the Army of Italy came through a combination of merit and political connections. The Directory planned a major offensive against Austria, France's principal remaining enemy. The main effort would be through Germany, but a supporting offensive would be launched from southern France and in northern Italy, then controlled by Austria and its ally, the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. The Army of Italy was considered a secondary theater, undersupplied, demoralized, and not expected to achieve much. Napoleon was given command partly because more senior generals were reluctant to accept what seemed like a thankless assignment. He arrived at his headquarters in Nice in March 1796, not yet 27 years old, to take command of an army of about 30,000 men who were poorly equipped, hungry, and skeptical of their new young general who looked more like a student than a commander. Napoleon transformed this situation through a combination of brilliant strategy, inspiring leadership, and ruthless efficiency. He addressed his troops, promising them victory, glory, and the wealth of the rich Italian plains if they followed him. Then he demonstrated that he could deliver on these promises. His strategic approach was revolutionary for the time. Rather than advancing slowly and cautiously as was conventional, Napoleon moved with speed, using forced marches to position his army where it could strike with concentrated force against divided enemies. He deliberately pushed his forces between the Austrian and Piedmontese armies to prevent them from combining, then defeated them in separate engagements. The campaign began in April 1796 with a series of rapid victories at Montanat, Malesimo, and Dago that knocked Piedmont-Sardinia out of the war within weeks, forcing them to sign an armistice. With Piedmont neutralized, Napoleon turned his full attention to the Austrians. Over the following months, he conducted a campaign that is still studied in military academies as a masterpiece of operational art. He consistently outmaneuvered Austrian commanders, using speed and deception to appear where unexpected, concentrate superior numbers at decisive points despite overall numerical parity or inferiority, and win decisive victories before Austrian reinforcements could arrive. Major victories at Lodi in May 1796, where he personally led a charge across a bridge under heavy fire, earning him legendary status among his soldiers, and at Arcole in November 1796, again marked by his personal courage, shattered Austrian forces and opened northern Italy to French occupation. Napoleon entered Milan in triumph, then moved south, occupying much of the Italian peninsula, setting up satellite republics, and extracting enormous wealth through contributions and art seizures that he sent back to France. The Italian campaign established Napoleon's reputation as a military genius. His success was built on several factors. Tactically, he used artillery more effectively than his opponents, concentrating fire to break enemy lines at decisive points. Operationally, he grasped the importance of speed and maneuver, understanding that rapid movement could compensate for numerical inferiority by allowing him to engage enemy forces before they could concentrate. Strategically, he understood the political dimensions of warfare, using propaganda to demoralize enemies and inspire his own troops, and skillfully negotiating with defeated opponents to secure favorable terms. He also demonstrated a willingness to ignore or reinterpret orders from Paris when necessary, taking independent action based on his assessment of the situation. This independent streak concerned the Directory, but they could not complain while he was winning. The campaign continued into 1797. Austrian forces, reinforced from Germany, launched several counteroffensives, but Napoleon defeated them repeatedly. By early 1797, he had advanced into Austria itself, approaching Vienna. The Austrian government, facing disaster on multiple fronts and exhausted by years of war, sued for peace. Napoleon, again exceeding his authority, negotiated directly with the Austrians. The resulting Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October 1797, was extremely favorable to France. Austria recognized French control of Belgium and the left bank of the Rhine, ceded northern Italy where Napoleon had established client republics, and received in compensation the territories of the Venetian Republic, which Napoleon cynically betrayed and partitioned despite Venice's neutrality. Napoleon returned to Paris in December 1797 as a conquering hero, the most celebrated general in France, having won a war that was supposed to be secondary and having enriched France with money, art treasures, and favorable peace terms. Napoleon's success created a political problem for the Directory. He was immensely popular with the army and public, far more so than any of the civilian politicians. He was also only 28 years old, ambitious, and clearly politically astute. The Directory members feared he might attempt a coup against them. They needed to find a way to keep him occupied and away from Paris. Napoleon himself, recognizing the political dangers of remaining in France without an active command, proposed a bold solution: an expedition to Egypt. The strategic rationale was to strike at British interests by threatening their routes to India and potentially establishing a French presence in the eastern Mediterranean. The Directory approved the expedition partly for strategic reasons, but also to remove Napoleon from France. The Egyptian expedition, launched in May 1798, was one of the most ambitious and ultimately futile campaigns in Napoleon's career. He sailed from Toulon with over 30,000 troops and a fleet of more than 300 ships, accompanied by 150 scholars and scientists who would study Egypt's history and culture. This scientific component reflected the Enlightenment character of the expedition and would produce the monumental description de l'Egypte, but it also highlighted the expedition's contradictions. It was simultaneously a military conquest and a mission of discovery and civilization. Napoleon evaded British Mediterranean patrols under Admiral Nelson, captured Malta en route in June, and landed in Egypt near Alexandria in early July 1798. Alexandria fell quickly, and Napoleon marched toward Cairo. The Battle of the Pyramids on July 21st, 1798, established French control over Egypt. Napoleon faced a Mamluk army much larger than his own, composed of mounted warriors who had dominated Egypt for centuries. Napoleon formed his infantry into large defensive squares, with artillery at the corners. The Mamluk cavalry charges, though brave and ferocious, were slaughtered by concentrated musket and artillery fire. The victory was complete, and Napoleon entered Cairo shortly after, presenting himself as a liberator from Mamluk oppression and declaring respect for Islam in an attempt to win over the local population. However, The situation quickly deteriorated. On August 1st, 1798, Admiral Nelson found a French fleet anchored in Abu Qir Bay near Alexandria and attacked at the Battle of the Nile. The British victory was total. The French fleet was destroyed, leaving Napoleon's army stranded in Egypt with no naval support or reliable supply line to France. Despite this disaster, Napoleon maintained control of Egypt and attempted to consolidate French rule. He established an administrative system, encouraged economic development, and patronized the scientific studies of the expedition. But the military situation was increasingly difficult. In February 1799, Napoleon marched into Ottoman Syria, modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Syria, to forestall an Ottoman counterattack and potentially open a route toward further conquests. The Syrian campaign proved disastrous. After some initial successes, the siege of Acre failed despite repeated assaults from March to May 1799. The city, defended by Ottoman forces advised by British naval officers and supplied by British ships, held out. Napoleon's army suffered from disease, especially plague, and mounting casualties. He was forced to retreat to Egypt, having failed to achieve his objectives and having lost thousands of men. Back in Egypt, Napoleon defeated an Ottoman landing force at Abu Qir Bay in July 1799, but the larger strategic situation was hopeless. The army was trapped, disease-ridden, and cut off from France. Meanwhile, news from Europe indicated that France was again in crisis. The War of the Second Coalition had begun, with French forces suffering defeats in Italy and Germany, reversing the gains of 1797. The Directory was increasingly unpopular and ineffective. Napoleon made a fateful decision, abandoning his army. He secretly sailed for France in August 1799 with a small group of trusted subordinates, leaving General Kleber in command. This act of abandoning his army was arguably dishonorable, though Napoleon rationalized it as necessary for France. He evaded British patrols and landed in southern France in October 1799 to find the political situation even more chaotic than reports had indicated. Napoleon arrived in Paris as the Directory was collapsing from internal divisions, corruption, and military defeats. Several conspirators, including Emmanuel Joseph Size, a member of the Directory, were planning a coup to establish a more authoritarian government. They needed a popular general to provide military backing and legitimacy. Napoleon, with his immense prestige and reputation, was perfect for their purposes. He agreed to participate, though he had his own plans that went beyond what the civilian conspirators envisioned. The coup was set for 18 Brumaire Year 8 in the revolutionary calendar, November 9, 1799. The plan was to frighten the legislature into voting emergency powers to a new temporary government led by Napoleon and others. The coup nearly failed due to poor execution. On November 9th, Napoleon was appointed commander of troops in Paris. The following day, legislative councils were convened at St. Cloud, outside Paris, supposedly for their safety from a fabricated Jacobin plot. When Napoleon entered the Council of 500 to demand their resignation, he was met with hostile shouts and possibly physical assault. He lost his composure and had to be escorted out. The situation was saved by his younger brother Lucien Bonaparte, who was president of the council, and by General Murat, who led grenadiers into the chamber to disperse the deputies at bayonet point. By the end of the day, through a combination of intimidation and procedural manipulation, a rump of intimidated legislators voted to dissolve the Directory and establish a new consulate government headed by 3 consuls, with Napoleon as first consul. The Brumaire coup established Napoleon as the effective ruler of France, though initially within a republican framework. Over the following months, he consolidated power systematically. A new constitution, the Constitution of Year 8, was drafted and approved in a plebiscite. It established the consulate with 3 consuls, but real power was concentrated in the first consul, Napoleon, who could appoint ministers, generals, and officials, and who controlled foreign policy and military matters. The other 2 consuls had consultative roles only. The legislative bodies were complex and weak, designed to rubber stamp rather than genuinely deliberate. Napoleon argued that France needed strong executive authority after a decade of revolutionary instability, and many French citizens, exhausted by chaos and war, agreed. Napoleon's domestic reforms from 1800 to 1804 were arguably as significant as his military victories. He sought to stabilize France by creating institutions that would transcend the revolutionary divisions between royalists, moderates, and radicals. He pursued a policy of amalgame, bringing together talented people from all political backgrounds into his administration. Former royalists, regicides, and Jacobins all served in his government if they were competent and willing to accept his authority. He established the Bank of France to stabilize currency and finance, reformed the tax system to be more efficient and equitable, and began the massive project of codifying French law. The Code Napoleon, or Napoleonic Code, promulgated in 1804, was Napoleon's most enduring domestic achievement. This civil code systematically organized French law, replacing the confusing patchwork of local customs, Roman law, and revolutionary legislation with a single, clear, rational legal code. It embodied Enlightenment principles and revolutionary reforms, while also reflecting Napoleon's conservative social views. The code established equality before the law, property rights, secular marriage, and religious tolerance. However, it also reinforced patriarchal family structures, giving husbands extensive authority over wives and limiting women's property rights and ability to work without permission. Despite these limitations, the Napoleonic Code became a model for legal systems worldwide, adopted in modified form across Europe, Latin America, and beyond, remaining in effect in France to this day and forming the basis for civil law systems globally. Napoleon also reformed education, establishing a centralized system of lycées, secondary schools, and specialized institutions like the École Polytechnique that emphasized mathematics, science, and meritocracy. He expanded and reorganized the Legion of Honor, established during the Consulate, as a reward for military and civil merit regardless of birth. Perhaps most significantly, he negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, ending the breach between the French state and Catholic Church that had existed since the Revolution. The Concordat recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens while maintaining state control over church appointments and property. This reconciliation with the Church helped stabilize the regime by winning over Catholic opinion while preserving revolutionary secularism. Militarily, Napoleon moved quickly to secure France's position. The War of the Second Coalition was still ongoing when he took power. In May 1800, he personally led an army across the Alps into Italy in a daring campaign to defeat Austrian forces. The famous image of Napoleon crossing the Alps, immortalized in paintings, captured the boldness of this operation. He won a crucial victory at Marengo on June 14, 1800, though the battle was closer than later propaganda admitted and was actually turned around by a subordinate's timely arrival when Napoleon's initial position was failing. Nonetheless, Marengo, combined with General Moreau's victory at Hohenlinden in Germany later that year, forced Austria to seek peace. The Treaty of Lunéville in February 1801 essentially restored the terms of Campo Formio, confirming French control over Belgium, the Rhineland, and northern Italy. With Austria defeated, Napoleon turned to Britain, France's remaining major enemy. Unable to invade Britain due to British naval superiority, and with both sides exhausted by years of warfare, negotiations led to the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802. This treaty temporarily ended the Revolutionary Wars. Britain returned most conquered French colonies except Trinidad and Ceylon, while France agreed to evacuate Naples and restore independence to the Papal States. The treaty was celebrated in both countries as bringing peace after nearly a decade of continuous war. Napoleon's prestige reached new heights. He had ended the wars victoriously and brought peace and stability to France. In the peaceful atmosphere following Amiens, Napoleon further consolidated his power. In August 1802, a new constitutional referendum was held, asking whether Napoleon should be consul for life. Through a combination of genuine popularity and managed plebiscites, the result was overwhelmingly affirmative. Over 3.5 million voted yes, fewer than 10,000 no. Napoleon became consul for life with the power to name his successor, moving France closer to monarchy while maintaining republican forms. He established an imperial court system, revived aristocratic etiquette, and surrounded himself with ceremony and grandeur that echoed the old monarchy. The republican ideals of the revolution were increasingly subordinated to authoritarian efficiency and personal rule. The Peace of Amiens proved short-lived. Tensions with Britain resumed over Malta, which Britain refused to evacuate as stipulated in the treaty, and over Napoleon's continued expansion of French influence in Europe. By May 1803, Britain and France were again at war. Napoleon assembled a grande army of over 150,000 men along the English Channel, constructing an invasion flotilla and training troops for a cross-channel assault. For over 2 years, Britain lived under the threat of French invasion. However, Napoleon could never achieve the naval superiority necessary to safely transport his army across the Channel. The British Royal Navy maintained control of the seas, and Napoleon's hopes of combining French and Spanish fleets to temporarily achieve local superiority were dashed by Admiral Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, which destroyed the Franco-Spanish fleet and confirmed British naval supremacy for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars. Even before Trafalgar, the strategic situation had changed. Austria and Russia, alarmed by French expansion and encouraged by British subsidies, formed a third coalition against France in 1805. Napoleon abandoned his invasion plans for Britain and rapidly marched his Grande Army from the Channel coast to the heart of Europe in one of the most brilliant strategic redeployments in military history. In October 1805, he surrounded an entire Austrian army under General Mack at Ulm and forced its surrender without a major battle. Over 50,000 Austrian troops captured through superior maneuver. Napoleon entered Vienna in November, but Austrian and Russian armies remained in the field. The decisive confrontation came on December 2nd, 1805, at Austerlitz in Moravia. The Battle of Austerlitz was Napoleon's greatest victory and is considered a masterpiece of tactics and battlefield deception. Facing combined Austrian and Russian forces that outnumbered him, Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank and feigned weakness to lure the Allies into attacking there. As the Allied left wing moved to envelop what they thought was Napoleon's exposed flank, he launched his main attack against the Allied center, which had been weakened by the redeployment. French forces broke through the center, splitting the Allied army and trapping significant forces on the Pratzen Heights. The Allied army was routed with over 25,000 casualties and thousands more captured, while French losses were under 10,000. The victory was so complete that Austria immediately sued for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg in December 1805 imposed harsh terms. Austria lost significant territories, paid huge indemnities, and effectively ceased to be a major power. Russia, though defeated, retreated beyond its borders rather than make peace. Following Austerlitz, Napoleon was at the zenith of his power. He had defeated 3 coalitions, and his dominance of continental Europe seemed complete. In December 1804, even before Austerlitz, he had taken the ultimate step of crowning himself Emperor of the French in a magnificent ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, attended by Pope Pius VII. In a symbolic gesture demonstrating that his power came from himself rather than divine right or papal authority, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head, then crowned his wife Josephine as empress. This act formalized what had become reality. France was an empire, and Napoleon was its absolute ruler. The transformation from Corsican artillery officer to Emperor of the French had taken just 16 years. As emperor, Napoleon reorganized Europe according to his vision. He placed family members on thrones across the continent. His brother Joseph became king of Naples in 1806, later king of Spain in 1808. His brother Louis became king of Holland in 1806. His brother Jerome became king of Westphalia in 1807. His stepson Eugene de Beauharnais became viceroy of Italy. He created the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states under French protection that effectively ended the Holy Roman Empire, which was formally dissolved in 1806 after over 800 years of existence. The old European order, based on ancient dynasties and imperial tradition, was being replaced by a new order based on Napoleon's will and military power. However, Napoleon's success bred new enemies. Prussia, which had remained neutral during the War of the Third Coalition, was alarmed by French dominance and the reorganization of Germany. In 1806, encouraged by Russia, Prussia rashly declared war on France. Napoleon's response was devastating. In the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt on October 14, 1806, fought simultaneously against divided Prussian forces, the French achieved crushing victories. The legendary Prussian army, built by Frederick the Great, was shattered. Napoleon pursued the remnants relentlessly, entering Berlin in late October and effectively destroying Prussia as an independent power within weeks. The campaign demonstrated Napoleon's ability to rapidly mobilize and deploy forces and his understanding of the importance of pursuing defeated enemies to prevent their reorganization. With Prussia defeated, Napoleon turned against Russia. The winter campaign of 1806 to 1807 was brutal, fought in the harsh conditions of Poland and East Prussia. At the Battle of Eylau in February 1807, Napoleon fought the Russians to a bloody stalemate in a snowstorm, suffering over 20,000 casualties in one of his costliest battles to date. Though technically a victory, Eylau showed that Russian forces were tougher opponents than the Austrians or Prussians. However, in June 1807, Napoleon decisively defeated the Russians at the Battle of Friedland, forcing Tsar Alexander I to negotiate. The two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Neman River at Tilsit in July 1807. The resulting treaties of Tilsit divided Europe into French and Russian spheres of influence. Prussia was severely reduced in size and forced to join Napoleon's continental system, the economic blockade against Britain. Russia became France's nominal ally, though this alliance was always fragile and based on convenience rather than genuine cooperation. The continental system was Napoleon's strategy to defeat Britain since he could not invade it. If he could not defeat the British Navy, he would strangle British trade by closing all European ports to British goods, forcing economic collapse. From 1806 onward, Napoleon enforced this system with increasing ruthlessness, demanding that all countries under French influence comply. The system caused hardship in Britain and some economic disruption, but it also imposed severe costs on continental countries that depended on trade, including France itself. Moreover, enforcing the system required ever-expanding French control, as Napoleon had to intervene wherever countries tried to circumvent the blockade. This dynamic drew France into conflicts in Spain and eventually led to the disastrous Russian campaign. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon later called it, began in 1808 and drained French resources for 6 years. Spain was officially a French ally, but Napoleon distrusted the Spanish government and was frustrated by Spanish violations of the continental system. Using deception and the pretext of occupying Portugal, which was trading with Britain, Napoleon moved French forces into Spain. In May 1808, he forced the Spanish royal family to abdicate and placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Napoleon expected Spain to accept this fait accompli as other countries had accepted similar impositions. Instead, the Spanish people rose in nationwide insurrection. The Spanish uprising of May 1808 marked the beginning of a brutal guerrilla war that would last until Napoleon's fall. The Peninsular War, as it became known, was unlike other Napoleonic conflicts. Rather than facing regular armies in set-piece battles where French military superiority told, French forces in Spain faced guerrilla warfare, ambushes, assassinations, raids, and popular resistance. The term guerrilla, meaning little war, entered the military lexicon from this conflict. Spanish irregular forces, supported by British expeditionary forces under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, and by Portuguese resistance, made Spain ungovernable for the French. Napoleon committed hundreds of thousands of troops to Spain. At its peak, over 300,000 French soldiers were tied down in the peninsula, yet could never achieve decisive control. French forces won most battles, but controlled little beyond where their armies physically stood. The brutality was extreme on both sides, with atrocities, massacres, and reprisals becoming routine. Napoleon personally campaigned in Spain in late 1808 and early 1809, winning victories and driving British forces to the coast, but he was forced to return to France due to renewed Austrian aggression. The War of the Fifth Coalition began in April 1809 as Austria, encouraged by French difficulties in Spain and hoping to recover its position, attacked French allies in Germany. Napoleon rushed from Spain and conducted another brilliant campaign, winning victories at Abensberg, Landshut, and Eckmühl in April 1809, then advancing on Vienna, which he occupied in May. However, the Austrians were not finished. At the Battle of Aspern-Essling in May 1809, Napoleon suffered his first clear tactical defeat, beaten by Archduke Charles in a battle that cost both sides heavy casualties. This defeat shocked Europe, showing that Napoleon was not invincible. Napoleon regrouped and in July 1809 won the massive Battle of Wagram, fought over 2 days and involving over 300,000 men. The victory forced Austria to accept peace once more, signing the Treaty of Schönbrunn in October 1809, which further reduced Austrian territory and influence. However, the victory was costly, French casualties were high, and Napoleon's aura of invincibility was diminished. Moreover, during the Wagram campaign, Napoleon was excommunicated by Pope Pius VII after annexing the Papal States and arresting the Pope. This alienated Catholic opinion and added to growing unease about Napoleon's power. Napoleon's personal life also changed dramatically during this period. His marriage to Josephine had been passionate early on, though she had been unfaithful during his campaigns, while he increasingly took mistresses. More seriously, Josephine had not borne him children and was now past childbearing age. Napoleon desperately wanted a legitimate heir to establish a dynasty. In December 1809, he divorced Josephine in a painful ceremony that left both in tears. He then sought a dynastic marriage to legitimize his empire through connection with an old European royal house. After considering several options, he married Marie-Louise, daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis I, in April 1810. This marriage aligned Napoleon with the Habsburg dynasty that had ruled much of Europe for centuries. In March 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles, who Napoleon immediately titled King of Rome. Napoleon now had his heir, and the Napoleonic dynasty seemed secure. At the peak of his power in 1810 to 1811, Napoleon controlled an empire stretching from Spain to Poland and from northern Germany to southern Italy. France itself had expanded to include Belgium, the Netherlands, the German Rhineland, and parts of Italy. Satellite kingdoms ruled by Napoleon's family or marshals covered much of the rest of Europe. Only Britain, Portugal, Sweden, and Russia remained outside French control, and Russia was nominally an ally. Napoleon seemed to have achieved what no one since Charlemagne had accomplished: hegemony over Europe. He ruled over 70 million subjects and commanded armies totaling over 500,000 men. His administrative reforms and legal codes were being implemented across his empire. For a brief moment, the Napoleonic system appeared stable. However, this appearance was deceptive. The empire was held together by military force and personal loyalty to Napoleon, not by genuine acceptance or shared interests. The continental system caused widespread resentment and economic hardship. Occupied peoples increasingly resented French rule, taxation, and conscription. Nationalism, ironically often inspired by the French Revolution's ideas of popular sovereignty, was turning against French domination. In Germany, Intellectual and political movements were developing that would eventually unite against French control. Spain remained in open rebellion, and most seriously, relations with Russia were deteriorating. The Franco-Russian alliance formed at Tilsit in 1807 was always fragile. Russia's economy suffered badly from the continental system since Russian trade traditionally relied heavily on British markets. Russian nobles, whose wealth came from agricultural exports, pressured Tsar Alexander I to resume trade with Britain. Additionally, Russia and France had conflicting interests in Poland and the Ottoman Empire. By 1811, it was clear that Russia was violating the continental system and that conflict was likely. Napoleon, unable to tolerate defiance and convinced that Russian submission was necessary to force British surrender, began preparing for war. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée of 1812 numbered over 600,000 men, drawn from France and all its allied and subject states. It was a truly multinational force, with French troops forming less than half the total. The Russian campaign of 1812 was the greatest military catastrophe of Napoleon's career. In June 1812, he crossed the Neman River into Russia with his massive army. His strategy was to defeat Russian armies in decisive battles near the border, forcing Russia to accept peace on French terms as other powers had done. However, the Russians, commanded by Generals Barclay de Tolly and Mikhail Kutuzov, avoided decisive engagement and retreated deeper into Russia, implementing a scorched earth policy that denied the French supplies. Napoleon advanced, winning engagements, but never achieving the decisive victory he sought. The French supply lines stretched ever longer while the army diminished through desertion, disease, and skirmishing. In early September 1812, the Russians finally offered battle at Borodino, just 70 miles from Moscow. The Battle of Borodino on September 7, 1812, was one of the bloodiest single-day battles in history. Over 250,000 men fought in a brutal frontal engagement that lasted all day. Napoleon's tactical performance was lackluster, possibly due to illness. He won the field, but at horrific cost. Combined casualties exceeded 70,000, with roughly equal losses on both sides. The Russians retreated in relatively good order, and a week later Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting Russian surrender. Instead, he found the city largely evacuated and, within days, burning in fires likely started by Russian patriots. Napoleon waited in the ruined city for over a month, hoping Alexander would negotiate, but no proposal came. In mid-October, with winter approaching and his army wasting away in Moscow without adequate supplies or shelter, Napoleon faced reality and ordered retreat. The retreat from Moscow became legendary for its horror. The Grande Armée, reduced already to perhaps 100,000 effective troops, marched back through devastated countryside already stripped of supplies during the advance. Russian forces harassed them constantly, while partisan guerrillas attacked stragglers. The weather, mild at first, turned bitterly cold in November. Soldiers froze, starved, and died by thousands daily. Discipline collapsed as men fought each other for food and warm clothing. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November, where French engineers built bridges under fire while Russian armies closed in, became an epic of military endurance, but also a slaughter that left thousands dead. When the remnants of the Grande Armée straggled out of Russia in December 1812, fewer than 40,000 organized troops remained of the 600,000 who had entered. The losses were catastrophic, easily over 400,000 dead, with thousands more captured or deserted. Napoleon had abandoned his army again, leaving for Paris in early December when news arrived of an attempted coup and to organize new forces. The disaster in Russia shattered the myth of French invincibility and demonstrated that Napoleon could be defeated. All across Europe, subject peoples and defeated powers took heart. The disaster immediately triggered the War of the Sixth Coalition. Prussia, which had been forced to contribute troops to the Russian campaign, switched sides in early 1813, joining Russia in alliance against France. Austria, though still nominally allied through Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise, remained neutral while strengthening its army. Sweden joined the coalition under Crown Prince Bernadotte, ironically a former French marshal whom Napoleon had placed on the Swedish throne. Britain continued supporting the coalition with subsidies and maintaining Wellington's army in Spain. Napoleon faced enemies on all fronts. Napoleon demonstrated remarkable resilience in 1813. He rapidly raised new armies in France, conscripting men who would earlier have been considered too young or too old. By spring 1813, he had assembled a force of over 200,000 men, though they were inexperienced and the quality of cavalry and artillery had declined due to losses in Russia. He won victories at Lutzen and Botzen in May 1813, but these were costly and indecisive. Neither side could achieve a knockout blow. An armistice in summer 1813 gave both sides time to regroup, but it was strategically more advantageous to the Allies, who used the time to bring Austria into the coalition and better coordinate their armies. When fighting resumed in August 1813, Napoleon faced overwhelming numbers as Austrian forces joined Russian and Prussian armies. The Allies adopted the Trachenberg Plan, avoiding Napoleon personally while attacking his marshals commanding detached forces, steadily reducing French strength. Napoleon won some victories, but could not be everywhere simultaneously. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of Nations. Over 500,000 men fought in a three-day battle that was the largest engagement in Europe prior to World War I. Napoleon was decisively defeated, losing over 70,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with enormous amounts of equipment. He retreated westward across Germany toward France, his German allies deserting him. By the end of 1813, French forces had been driven from Germany and Spain, and Allied armies were preparing to invade France itself. The campaign of 1814 on French soil saw Napoleon at his most brilliant tactically, conducting a masterful defensive campaign against overwhelming odds. With an army that never exceeded 70,000 men, many of them raw conscripts, he faced Allied forces totaling over 300,000 invading from the east and south. Napoleon fought a series of rapid battles, using interior lines to shift forces quickly between threats and win local victories against separated Allied columns. At Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Vauchamps in February 1814, he won victories reminiscent of his earlier genius. However, strategic realities could not be overcome by tactical brilliance alone. He lacked the numbers to defend all of France, and the Allies steadily advanced, absorbing losses he could not replace. Politically, the situation was also impossible. Napoleon refused Allied peace offers that would have left France with its natural borders, holding out for more favorable terms. The Allies, having suffered from Napoleon's repeated comebacks, were increasingly convinced that permanent peace required his removal. French public opinion was turning against him as war devastation mounted on French soil and conscription demands became unbearable. Even some of Napoleon's marshals, exhausted by years of war and wealthy from their conquests, began to desire peace more than continued glory. When Paris fell to Allied forces on March 31st, 1814, after Napoleon had moved his army away from the capital to threaten Allied communications, it was essentially over. Napoleon's marshals and close associates, led by Talleyrand, who had long been plotting with the Allies and faced with Napoleon's refusal to accept inevitable defeat, forced his hand. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated at Fontainebleau, though initially only in favor of his son. When the Allies and Talleyrand rejected this and restored the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII, Napoleon attempted suicide using poison he had carried since the Russian campaign, but the poison had lost its potency and he survived. On April 11th, he signed an unconditional abdication. The Treaty of Fontainebleau granted him sovereignty over the small island of Elba off the Italian coast, with a pension from the French government and permission to keep a guard of 400 soldiers. The Allies allowed this rather than imprisoning or executing him, partly from lingering respect and partly to avoid making him a martyr. Napoleon arrived on Elba in May 1814 and threw himself into governing his tiny realm with the same energy he had applied to Europe. He reorganized the island's administration, improved roads and public works, and created a small court. However, he closely followed events in France and Europe, learning that the Bourbon Restoration was unpopular, that the Congress of Vienna was deadlocked by disputes among the victorious powers, and that the French government was withholding his pension. More importantly, he received reports that he might be transferred to a more remote location like Saint Helena. Isolated, bored, and believing an opportunity existed, Napoleon made an audacious decision. He would return to France. On February 26, 1815, with about 1,000 men, Napoleon escaped from Elba on ships that evaded British naval patrols, landing in southern France at Golfe on March 1st. The gamble's success depended on whether the French army would fight for the restored Bourbons or rally to Napoleon. As he advanced north toward Paris, the answer became clear. Troops sent to arrest him instead joined him. At Grenoble, an entire regiment went over to him when Napoleon appeared before them alone, opening his coat and daring them to shoot their emperor. Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, instead embraced him and joined his cause when they met. The Bourbon government collapsed without a fight, and Louis XVIII fled to Belgium. On March 20th, 1815, exactly 20 days after landing, Napoleon entered Paris in triumph and resumed rule as emperor. The 100 Days, as this period became known, was Napoleon's last attempt to restore his empire. However, the context had fundamentally changed. The major European powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and mobilized their armies to remove him. No possibility of diplomatic recognition existed. Napoleon claimed he wanted peace, promised liberal constitutional reforms, and announced he would respect Europe's independence. Few believed him. France was exhausted and divided. While many common soldiers and some veterans rallied to Napoleon, much of the bourgeoisie and peasantry wanted peace and stability, not renewed war. Napoleon could raise an army of perhaps 280,000 men, but large portions had to garrison potentially rebellious regions like the Vade and the South. Napoleon's strategy was to strike before the Allied armies could fully mobilize and concentrate. In June 1815, he led the Army of the North, about 125,000 men, into Belgium to attack two Allied armies there, Blücher's Prussian army of about 120,000 and Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army of about 95,000, before they could unite. His plan was to defeat them separately, then march on Brussels and hopefully trigger a political crisis among the Allies. On June 16th, Napoleon fought Blücher at Ligny, while Marshal Ney engaged Wellington at Quatre-Bras. The Battle of Ligny was a French victory. Blücher's army was battered and forced to retreat. However, Ney failed to pin Wellington, and, crucially, Napoleon lost track of Blücher's retreat direction. Napoleon believed the Prussians were retreating eastward away from Wellington and would be unable to quickly rejoin battle. This miscalculation proved fatal. Blücher actually retreated northward, maintaining contact with Wellington's forces. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon attacked Wellington's army, which had taken up defensive positions on a ridge near the village of Waterloo, south of Brussels. Napoleon was confident, believing he faced only Wellington's 68,000 troops with his 72,000 men and superior artillery. The Battle of Waterloo began late in the morning, delayed by muddy ground from overnight rain that hindered artillery positioning. Napoleon launched repeated attacks on Wellington's defensive line, particularly focusing on the center and the fortified farm of Hougoumont on the right. Wellington's forces, composed of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, held firm despite heavy casualties, aided by strong defensive positions and Wellington's tactical skill. The battle hung in the balance throughout the afternoon. Napoleon committed his Imperial Guard, his elite veteran reserve, in a final assault at around 7 p.m. The Guard advanced in column up the ridge, having never been defeated in battle. They were met by withering fire from British infantry in line formation, who had been lying down behind the ridge crest to avoid artillery. The Guard faltered, then broke. The unthinkable had happened. At this critical moment, Prussian forces under Blücher, who had force-marched his army across difficult terrain all day despite his own injuries from Ligny, arrived on Napoleon's right flank in strength. The French army, already exhausted and demoralized by the Guard's repulse, collapsed in a rout. Napoleon left the field as his army disintegrated, with Wellington and Blücher pursuing through the night. The Battle of Waterloo was over. Napoleon had lost decisively. Napoleon retreated to Paris, briefly considered continuing resistance, but his political support had evaporated. The legislature forced him to abdicate again on June 22, 1815. He briefly considered escaping to America, but found British naval forces blockading all ports. On July 15, 1815, Napoleon surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland of HMS Bellerophon, throwing himself on British protection and hoping for asylum in England. Instead, the British government decided to permanently exile him to Saint Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, 1,200 miles from the nearest land. The Allies were determined there would be no third comeback. Napoleon arrived at Saint Helena in October 1815 and would spend the remaining 5.5 years of his life there. The island was chosen specifically for its remoteness and difficulty of escape. He was guarded by British troops and officials, living at Longwood House, a damp, rat-infested former barn converted into residence. His conditions, while not physically brutal, were psychologically oppressive. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, treated Napoleon as a prisoner and General Bonaparte rather than an emperor, which Napoleon found insulting. Petty restrictions and surveillance were constant. Napoleon had a small entourage of loyal followers who had accompanied him into exile, and he spent his time dictating memoirs, justifying his actions, and shaping his legacy. The memoirs and accounts produced at St. Helena were Napoleon's final campaign, a propaganda effort to influence how history would remember him. He portrayed himself as a champion of the revolution's principles, a defender of France against reactionary European monarchies, and a victim of British treachery. He emphasized his civil reforms, particularly the Code Napoleon, and minimized or justified his wars as defensive necessities. This narrative, spread through published accounts by his followers like Las Cases' Memorial de Saint Helena, was remarkably successful in shaping Napoleon's posthumous reputation, creating the Napoleonic legend that persists today. Napoleon's health deteriorated during his exile. He suffered from various ailments, gained weight from inactivity, and became increasingly lethargic. Modern analysis suggests he likely suffered from stomach cancer, possibly exacerbated by the conditions at Longwood. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at age 51. His last words, according to witnesses, were ambiguous, possibly France, army, head of the army, Josephine. He was buried on St. Helena in an unmarked grave, as the British and French could not agree on what inscription to use. The British insisted on Napoleon Bonaparte, while his followers demanded the Emperor Napoleon. Napoleon's body remained on St. Helena for 19 years until French politics changed. In 1840, during the July Monarchy under King Louis-Philippe, Napoleon's nephew Louis Napoleon, who would later become Emperor Napoleon III, arranged for the return of Napoleon's remains to France. The British government agreed, and in a grand ceremony in December 1840, Napoleon's body was brought to Paris and entombed at Les Invalides in a magnificent porphyry sarcophagus. Hundreds of thousands attended the ceremony. Napoleon had finally returned to France permanently. Napoleon's legacy is complex and contested. Militarily, he was undoubtedly one of history's greatest commanders, winning dozens of battles through innovative tactics, strategic vision, rapid maneuver, and inspiring leadership. His campaigns are still studied in military academies worldwide. He revolutionized warfare through core organization, living off the land to increase mobility and concentration of force at decisive points. His grand tactics influenced military thinking for generations. However, his military genius was accompanied by enormous human cost. The Napoleonic Wars resulted in 3 to 6 million deaths, devastated Europe, and traumatized a generation. Domestically, Napoleon's reforms had lasting positive impact. The Napoleonic Code provided a rational, modern legal framework that spread across Europe and influenced legal systems globally. His educational reforms, administrative systems, and meritocratic principles helped create modern state institutions. He ended feudalism in territories he controlled and promoted religious tolerance and civil equality, at least for men. However, he also destroyed the French Republic, established autocratic rule, censored press and speech, and used secret police to suppress opposition. His treatment of women was regressive, restricting their rights in the Napoleonic Code. Politically, Napoleon's impact on Europe was profound and contradictory. He destroyed the old order of the Holy Roman Empire and forced European states to modernize their institutions to compete with France. His reforms planted seeds of liberalism and national consciousness that would flower in the 19th century. Yet he also provoked nationalist resistance to French domination that led to the rise of more aggressive nationalisms. His legacy was claimed by both liberals, who emphasized his revolutionary origins and reforms, and authoritarians, who admired his strong leadership and military glory. Napoleon lived 51 years, but he fundamentally altered Europe's political order. The victories he won on battlefields matter less, in the long run, than the legal system and modern state concepts he left behind, which still influence us today. So what do you think? If he hadn't been defeated at Waterloo or exiled to Saint Helena, what kind of world would we be living in? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's discuss together.